Okay, I think we're rolling. Hello and welcome to this paper presentation for the International Conference Design Principles and Practices 2022. My name is Dr. Krzysztof Miński and I will be presenting to you today the topic of art thinking, a new model for transdisciplinary collaboration. Firstly, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Awabakal and Worimi people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting from today. To begin this presentation, I would also just like to give you a little bit of a background to myself, just to provide some context and in particular for some of the topics that I'll be addressing today. Firstly, I hold the academic position of part-time lecturer here at the University of Newcastle, a position that I've held since the beginning of 2021. I'm also the founder and CEO of the Australian company Art Thinking, and I currently represent the Austrian organization Ars Electronica as the official ambassador. And while I'm sure wearing all of these hats may seem a little bit confusing at the moment, I think it will become apparent that these roles really complement each other as my research and teaching is informed by the professional practice. So just to give a little bit more context, this is basically the space that I have been working in for the last several years, where my work and position has somehow involved having one foot inside and one foot outside the academic institution. And often this involves creating projects at the intersection of academia, industry, and government. And this excerpt from my recently published PhD gives you a visual impression of this working model. This model has been heavily influenced by projects and collaborations that I've been involved in during my time at Ars Electronica. An example of this was the initiative that was developed with Japanese partners, and I'm very much inspired by this notion of the city as a laboratory. And here you can see an example from the 2014 initiative under the framing of Tokyo as a laboratory for the future. There's just a link there at the bottom in case you want some further information about that program. And since returning to Newcastle in 2020, I was immediately very inspired by the fact that these types of initiatives are also existing here. These are examples that I have lifted from the strategic plans of both the university and the council, which is referring to a priority initiative around this living lab model. So there's a very nice synergy there in terms of my research and my experience and my work. And now in my capacity and role at the University of Newcastle, I'm also working on developing a high-level partnered program linking the Ars Electronica and the university. I see there's many synergies and opportunities in particular between the Ars Electronica Futurelab, the primary case study of my PhD research and a focal point of the presentation today, and the university's flagship Future Art, Science and Technology Lab, a new initiative that will be featured throughout this conference by various colleagues, and in particular, Professor Paul Eggleston, who I am closely collaborating with to develop this international partnership and associated programs. So the first thing that I wanted to propose today is this notion of the city being a transdisciplinary lab. This was a notion that was first introduced to me by my PhD principal supervisor, Professor Richard Vella. And just to underscore that, and also to give reference to something I'll be talking throughout this presentation to, is my recently completed PhD research and this model, which features in the conclusion of that PhD, which is a visualization of a prototype system. This system focuses on trying to develop a new and sustainable creative ecology that talks both to economic rational interests, but also cultural investments. And the next step and stage of my research is to continue to refine and develop this model. Okay, so just to kick off, I would like to give some historical background to the term art thinking itself. This is a relatively new term, and by now some of you are probably wondering what's the connection to design thinking, which is of course probably a far more well-known term, and that's something I will definitely get to throughout the presentation. However, for now, I just wanted to provide some important references to the development of this terminology thus far. In terms of academic writing, it's relatively thin, although for those who are interested, I would highly recommend the last reference that's listed here, which was led by a former colleague of mine from the Futurelab, who is now a Vice Chancellor of Innovation at a leading Austrian university. And as that paper also references, and a lot of what I'll be focusing on today is specifically how this term has developed out of this unique ecosystem in Austria, which is the Ars Electronica. So located in Linz in Upper Austria, the Ars Electronica has been working at the intersection of art, technology and society since 1979. It started as an experimental art festival and has grown into this significant organization and permanent infrastructure that has basically made the city an international focal point for artistic-led innovation. At the European Economic Forum in 2016, the Digital Commissioner for the EU singled out Ars Electronica as the leading example of where artists and industry come together to create products of the future. And here from a recently published book in 2019 is a reference quote that I think really gives a nice quick overview to where has this art thinking term come from. And here you can see that when referring to this idea of art thinking, I guess it's trying to also provide context to the idea of what is Ars Electronica as an organization, or art thinking being Ars thinking or Ars Electronica thinking. So in a way, I guess over the last decade or so, the Ars Electronica has been kind of interrogating its own process in order to share this knowledge and its success back into the world, because it has so much international attention. And I think they're finding this very useful as a way to try and provide some context, but also, as I think you'll see throughout the context of the throughout the course of this presentation, a very unique way of operating, something that they definitely have never been interested in terms of franchising as such, but they are very open to the idea of sharing this way of working and collaborating with partners all over the world. Okay, so just on this timeline here, you can see, as I mentioned, the start of the Ars Electronica being a festival in 1979. It started then and continues to operate and function as this platform at the intersection between art, technology, and importantly, society. So that's something that kind of runs through all of the work that they're doing. I don't want to focus too much on all of these various arms of the Ars Electronica. That would take up too much time, and is not the focus point of this presentation today. However, I just wanted to draw your attention there to that milestone at 1996. So this was the development of the permanent infrastructure of the Ars Electronica Center, and also when the Ars Electronica Futurelab started. So that was almost 25 years ago. Okay, so there's several ways that Ars Electronica refers to this notion of art thinking. Firstly, in the Ars Electronica Center itself, this team is dedicated to curating real-world experiences with the future, and the big topics, I guess, of to do with technology that's changing the future and the big science and technology of our time. It was once labeled the Museum of the Future, and it began to transition into using the term of School of the Future. I think that was somewhere around a decade ago. So it's really focused on this idea of creating accessible experiences with the science and with the technology inside this infrastructure. And it was also one of the first, I think maybe even the first kind of museum centers of such to implement this kind of hands-on scientific laboratory approach in a publicly accessible infrastructure. And here you can just see some of the images from inside the center. So whether it's dealing with the topics of artificial intelligence or robotics, or there on the top right, you can see the biolab, which for instance had a certified DNA sequencing machine right there inside the lab. They're really interested in terms of how you can enable the untrained audience to get some deep insight into, again, these big topics to do with the science, the technology, and the future. And here, this slide is one I've lifted from a previous Ars Electronica presentation, but I think this is just a first nice, quick introduction to the way that this idea of art thinking is operating. So it kind of positions this I guess, phenomenological position where science creates knowledge through explanation and art creates meaning and knowledge through experience. So here is this, I guess, idea that can be underpinned by very old academic theory as well, whether that's to do with Dewey and the artist's experience, or Merleau-Ponty, this idea of being able to gain knowledge in the world through our experience in the world, and whether that's teaching and education or through this public accessible infrastructure, that's a lot of what the work is focused on. Okay, but most importantly, and in the context of the paper that I'll be submitting and for today's presentation, I want to really focus on the work that's happening inside the Ars Electronica Futurelab, which is where the Ars Electronica is really, I guess, focusing this idea of the art thinking mindset. And I very carefully use the word mindset as opposed to methodology there, but using this idea of the art thinking framework in an applied artistic research context. So as I mentioned before, the Ars Electronica Futurelab has been in operation for over 25 years. And it's been using this approach, or using experimental art making, as this catalyst for transdisciplinary collaboration. And here you can just see briefly the scope of the kind of industry partners they've been working with, academic partners. So it's a very well-established research lab that exists inside this very unusual cultural ecosystem. So I think an important point to make is that, of course, it's well known that you've got these highly trained disciplines working together, but I think the thing that makes places like the Futurelab unique is that they're constantly working together side by side on a daily basis. And in my research and in my PhD, this is what I'm referring to as a permanent, ongoing, open-ended type of collaboration that's happening between these highly trained disciplines and people on a daily basis. So I want to focus your attention on this idea that it's the working together that exists before, in between, and aside from the problems and questions or the tasks that need to be done in terms of the projects. So what my research is essentially arguing is that it's quite rare to find, and especially I think in university environments where you have that kind of close concentration of all of those disciplines constantly working together. And as I will get deeper into through the course of this presentation, I therefore argue that I think at most what universities are able to achieve is more of an interdisciplinary approach to problem solving. And I just want to also emphasize that it's the purpose of this presentation and also my work and research. It's not to be critical of that, because I think that that's actually essential work that is happening in the applied interdisciplinary context. My work is very interested in what is happening inside these quite, I would say, rare transdisciplinary research environments, and the Futurelab, I would argue, being one of them and one of the most established that exists in the international context. I also just want to bring your attention to this statement at the below there, this idea of art being like water and everything can get wet. It was the nature of my PhD research, which was being conducted at the Ars Electronica Futurelab and under the co-supervision of the founder and director, Horst Hortner, that I would have many conversations with Horst and other colleagues about my research. And it was during one such conversation with Horst where I was referencing findings from a plethora of publications promoting a STEAM versus STEM discourse, when this kind of statement from him slipped out, almost out of frustration. And this was a significant moment in the research because it kind of jolted me or changed my way of what I was thinking and how I was being, I think, influenced by a lot of the research at the time. So here you can see, firstly on the top left, some initial model development in my research, and then some other work that was coming out of Ars Electronica at the time from future fellow researchers, including the artistic director of the whole Ars Electronica, Gerfried Stocker. And this started to also really lead my focus towards this concentration on this idea of the art thinking. So here you can see in this series of diagrams, that top right there, that was a diagram which was from a slide that I saw in a presentation from my former colleague Hideaki Ogawa from the Ars Electronica Futurelab, who's now also a co-director of the Ars Electronica Futurelab. And here he was already looking to describe this unique approach. And it's also important to note that as it has developed out of Ars Electronica, which is contrary to some of the ways art thinking as a term has developed from other sources, but within this context, there's also this approach which is really focusing on a complementary model to design thinking. So that's a really important thing to mention, that it's not a counter to, but rather a complementary system, where one is strategic and a closed-ended approach, or as I try to argue in my research, the other is an ongoing, highly experimental, playful, and focused approach, constantly sort of channeled towards discovering. And just here in the top left corner as well, that's just something which was just initial scribble, but that was informed by this these kind of discussions I was having with Horst, and this idea of, you know, art is like water. It's not the idea that the disciplines are working side by side in this format. It's actually more of this idea that the art making is kind of like the philosophical framework that's happening underneath everything else. Okay, so to explain this a little bit further, I want to now show a case study from also my research, but it's also a case study that is quite well known in terms of the Ars Electronica Futurelab, and also in terms of innovative and paradigm shifting art forms. So I'll just play a little bit of this video now. So this is the project that was called Spaxels. Spaxels is a term that was coined by the Ars Electronica Futurelab, which essentially means space pixels. And this was a project that formed out of the Ars Electronica Futurelab in 2012, during my time as a senior researcher there. And it was, without doubt, I would say, one of the most thrilling, risky, and rewarding projects that I've been involved in. And this vision that you're watching now was the first ever drone light show and largest outdoor swarm of unmanned aerial vehicles in the world. So that was in 2012. So I know this video is probably a bit shaky with the Zoom recording. So again, you'll see the link there at the bottom if you want to go back and watch any of this content. Okay, another fascinating thing about this project was how quickly it attracted a market. So within the next 4 years, the Futurelab would partner with some of the world's largest companies and tour this project, these light shows all over the world. And an example of this here you'll see in the bottom left was the project in Brisbane, which I led in 2013. And this project in particular just required many months of deliberation with the Civil Aviation Authority to essentially change the laws so that we were able to bring the show to Australia and present this work. And one of the really interesting outcomes, which was definitely not intended, it was more of an unintended response from this project, for example, in Australia, was the response from drone technology experts that were promoting how this art project influenced necessary and positive change in terms of changing policy that would then allow applied swarm research for things like crisis response situations that are deemed unsafe for humans. So this article is just as an example from the Australian is talking about that and mentioned several of the researchers that we collaborated with on this project to get it over the line, including the Australian Research Centre for Aerospace Automation out of the Queensland University of Technology. Okay, and today we see these incredible drone light shows all over the world, including this one recently there on the right of screen, which was New Year's Eve in Sydney Harbour. So it's really a remarkable development that can really all be traced back to this small experimental and transdisciplinary thinking lab in Austria. And in fact, several of the team members featured in that video on the right are former Futurelab colleagues that went on to develop the Intel Shooting Star system after the collaboration between Intel and Ars Electronica on the next stage of the development towards the Drone 100 project. So also though here on the left, just another reference to the Spaxels paper that was first published in 2012. So it's a really fascinating read if you're interested in the development of this technology and the initial experiments. And in that paper, it's basically referring to these initial experiments, you know, just trying to control a pixel in open space and then what would be the potential of developing that further, adding to this idea of a complex system of many pixels in open space, predicting a kind of a paradigm shifting, revolutionary display system, and then even referring to this idea of the future of fireworks, which is really what we're seeing today. And with every new amazing drone show, this is basically what's being promoted, in this idea that you know, less fireworks in the future being replaced by this technology and the pros and cons that come from that. And at the top there, just a little bit of a statement paying homage to the great John Maeda, who I think is a very well-renowned international designer, I think has really also made some really strong statements of this space between what is art and design. And I really like this idea of talking about, you know, art creating questions and innovation being the ability to respond to those questions within the context of my research. Okay, so what you're seeing here on this screen, this is a diagram from my PhD research, and this shows the timeline development of the Spaxels project. So again, this was a case study from my research, and here you can see that I've basically started to map this model that's in development, and then I'm basically creating a timeline of the project as it developed, all the way from these initial experiments, the failures, you know, rejection from drone manufacturers about the viability of the idea, all the way up to you know, that really successful partnership with Intel, and then later a spin-off company, and now many companies that are doing this kind of work. So as you can see here by the shapes and the colors, this project that I'm mapping towards and what I'm proposing starts to really focus and concentrate on this initial blue area, which is this art thinking area, and this very open collaborative space, which then starts to move towards a more refined, coordinated problem-solving approach. So, and there you can see, again, some of the things I'm interested in. I'm trying to unpack the difference between when it's a purely highly open collaborative type of work and when it starts to become more refined towards a coordinated cooperative approach. And just briefly here, just for a bit more context, these are other examples from other projects. So Spaxels was one of several projects that I was examining through the context of my research, as I was actually heavily involved in these projects, as well as examining the Futurelab as a case study in itself at the same time. And I think it's also important to mention that during my research, I also conducted field research, and I visited other world-leading examples of what I would consider to be transdisciplinary labs. And I don't think there's many other stronger examples than the MIT Media Lab, which I just found fascinating. It's kind of like, for me, a future lab that has many different future labs all interconnected. There's a lot of really interesting correlations there between the various labs and the way they operate and the size and the amount of people before they get too big and need too many structures, so on and so forth. But yeah, it was really, really impressive. And then it was even more impressive then to look at some of the research that's come out of the MIT Media Lab that is also about its own processes and how I could compare my model to that work, and in particular the work of Professor Hiroshi Ishii and Neri Oxman, the later who positioned, again, this clear separation between the creative processes in art and design, but also then the intersection between them, which I think is really important to think about, this space between very divergent thinking towards convergent thinking, which is also, I think, an important thing to mention in the context of the research. And I also looked at many other models throughout my research that were investigated through crossing creativity theory, creative collaboration theory, group creativity, knowledge management, and then also transdisciplinary collaboration. So I just want to hone in on two of those models in particular for the focus of today's presentation. And it's these two, I think, quite well-known models. The first being a model of the design thinking method from the IDEO design thinking process, the design school, and then below that, the model which is referring to disciplinarities. And I think that provides a pretty nice and interesting overview of the separation between and going from intra to multi, cross, inter, and transdisciplinary approaches. Okay, so what you're seeing here is I've basically flipped the bottom model upside down and repositioned this model. This becomes kind of a visualization of my proposition that design thinking is a creative problem-solving method that comes after transdisciplinary collaboration. And I think is far better to be framed more as an interdisciplinary collaboration. And this is because, by and large, a problem or a question has already been determined prior to the activity, and then different people from different disciplines and perspectives are brought together to work towards an end, usually a creative solution. So I would argue that this is often the case in most academic institutions also, as I mentioned before, because there's often a physical separation of space, sometimes even considerable space between countries and continents, between the interdisciplinary teams that then come together to work together. This issue, or this issue that I see more and more, is that this term interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity are often intertwined or used in the same context. And I think this is a problem, and that's what my research tries to address and tries to bring new perspectives on. And I indeed think there is a difference between interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. These next slides show the development of my own model and how I was reworking these existing models. So not only flipping, superimposing. The model up on the top right is worth a mention, I think, also because this notion of prototyping is a much looser form of prototyping I found really interesting as well, and started to incorporate that into the development of the model. And here you see more versions of the model. Color became a really important factor. So blue was inspired by the art like water reference, green, this notion of bringing these ideas into the world, and red denotes this kind of often difficult territory of operation where it becomes more of a cooperation, and that's where things can often get quite tricky, and in particular where things like trust issues start to arise and IP conflicts and so on and so forth. And here again is the final model. So I know there's a lot going on there, and I don't have the time to unpack all of that for you today. But in the context of the paper, I'll really be sort of focusing on this idea of that transdisciplinary finding to interdisciplinary utilizing space, and really trying to unpack that further and underpin that with the theoretical perspectives, as was the case within the PhD research. But again, I want to focus your attention here on this blue area. So that's the space that I think is far more difficult to justify in terms of this economic rational world we predominantly live in. But at the same time, history has shown so many examples of these innovative ecosystems that develop out of nothing and thrive in what some might probably refer to as irrational. To refer back to the model of Professor Hiroshi Ishii from MIT Media Lab, that was shown earlier. It's also because it's far easier to rationalize short-term outcomes rather than long-term visions. But again, I just want to reinforce that art thinking is by no means counter to design thinking, but it's complementary. So, I love design. I love design methods as a way to bring these ideas and imagination into the world. But at the same time, we must allow for time and space just to play and just imagine together, to really just focus and bathe in the idea of just, vision searching, vision making, exploration, and without the strict timeline of these early stages of a design thinking workshop. It's my belief, I think, or my feeling, as art itself, or as artists, they thrive when they can just be free to create without parameters. It's often just prior to any set conditions or methods that have been decided. It's the methods, or discovering also the methods or the best tool for a job, that often comes after. So that's just, again, a little bit of a spiel in the context of where we're coming from with this idea of art thinking. So in conclusion, I just also want to mention that for my thesis, the approach was not just to test the model itself, but rather the criteria extracted from the model against various case studies. So I see this criteria as a bit of a guide to applying and developing new art thinking or transdisciplinary thinking environments. And these were places that Portner referred to as Handlungsräume, or that's the plural, Handlungsraum, which is another one of these fantastic German compound words that it carries a number of meanings. And upon investigating various translations, I found it could mean, for instance, a way to encounter through learning. It also is a way to describe when you are stuck in a situation and you have to invent a way out of that situation. So it refers to a threshold between the difficulty of a situation and how quickly and creatively you can escape. It also is the ability to live and thrive in unfamiliar environment. But most importantly, as it was referred to in the context of transdisciplinarity, is when one discipline's Handlungsraum overlaps with another, the horizon becomes expanded. And this was a really other interesting part of the research. So it happened because I came across this interview with Horst from Ross Harley, who Ross has also been a collaborator with Ars Electronica in the past, from UNSW. And through that interview, I found this term around space for action or space of action. So I was really intrigued by that when I read that real-time article. And then I went back and I was having this conversation with Horst, and this was very interesting. And he was trying to elaborate on this further. And here you can see, which is an excerpt from the PhD, where he was explaining this is a mental space that we need to encounter when we want to interfere with other disciplines. And one needs to understand at least enough of the foreign discipline to be able to create their own perspective in the field. And this is what he was trying to express with this term of space for action, or rather the Handlungsraum. Again, often these words exist in German that can explain, you know, it can have multiple definitions for one purpose. And just a final quote here, which was from the same interview. And I think this is kind of sums up what I've also been presenting today, where you have to think of the transdisciplinary approach that takes into account the fact that there are fields that don't even exist yet. So there is no discipline for a certain area yet. We need to expand across the fields where no discipline can be home. And this is the place where the crazy ideas come up that may not survive in their own discipline, but which make a lot of sense to those in other disciplines. And that's what I call the soil for growing innovation. And this is where the crossover of ideas can happen and where new things can grow. So thanks a lot for listening to my presentation. It was a pleasure to be part of this conference, and I look forward to receiving any questions and of course, any new contacts for future collaborations. Thank you very much and goodbye.